Hello, and welcome to the Science Fiction and Translation panel at FutureCon. I am Rachel Cordasco, and we will be discussing all things world SF translation, decentering, Anglophone science fiction, and kind of making sure that we're talking more about the bridges that connect all the different languages and different traditions. And I want to invite the public to ask any questions that you have that you want us to address on the YouTube chat. And we will respond to some of them, as many as we can at the end. So first I want to introduce everybody, and if you want to say a quick thing about yourself or what you do, please do that. So first we have Cristina Macía. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Not really. I am a translator. I write cookbooks. I make a lot of jokes. Let's hope we can combine the three things right now. Instead, maybe the cookbooks, maybe not.
Awesome. Okay, and next we have Cheryl Morgan.
Hello, everybody. So yes, I'm Cheryl Morgan, and I do a whole bunch of things related to translation, which is quite surprising, really, because I'm useless at languages. I speak a lot of computer languages and a little bit of French and a little bit of Welsh, and possibly a bit of Latin as well, but certainly not enough to do any actual translations. But I do publish translations. I own a little publishing company called Wizard's Tower Press. We've got one book in Croatian out at the moment and another one launching any day now.
Very exciting. Okay, and we have Emily Jin.
Hi, I'm Emily. I do translations from Chinese into English and the other way around. I'm currently pursuing a PhD at Yale University at the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature. So I'm a bit nocturnal right now because I'm stuck in Beijing and having all these kind of late night classes, but I'm staying very awake for this panel.
Sounds good. And finally, we have Raul Ciannella.
Ciao. I'm Raul. I'm from Italy, but I'm currently living in Barcelona, where I run this little bookshop. I have, yeah, and I'm a translator from English, Catalan, and Spanish into Italian, and I did some translation from English into Spanish as well, together with my couple, Maria Antonia Martí. And I'm also doing a PhD. I'm in the final phases of my thesis on science fiction writer, translator, and editor Roberta Rambelli, one of the pioneers in Italian science fiction. And that's it. And
as a side note, my translation of one of Raul's stories is coming out in anthology at some point. I haven't heard anything recently. Yeah, it's a great story. Okay, so I guess for the first question that I wanted to ask, and I'm just gonna kind of go in the same order, if that's okay, with everybody, is that over the past several decades, English has acted as a bridge language in SF and translation. So it's been, Stanislaw Lem, when he'd come out with a new novel or story, it would be in English, and then maybe in, I'm just kind of pulling names out. It'll be in English and then in another language, or from Portuguese or from Russian. But that hasn't always been the case, and it's also kind of been true from our perspective. But then if you kind of dig into the background of some of these books, you can see, in fact, English had nothing to do with any of the translations until, after it had been in other languages. So if I could just give a couple of examples. I was looking up some recent books, and for instance, some of Sergei Lukyanenko, you might know him from the Night Watch series. His books in Russian, he's got a whole series that have only been translated into German. Also, a lot of Michel Houellebecq's novels from French have been translated into German before English. The Three Body Problem was translated into Korean before it was translated into English. And all of Rodrigo Frazan, his novels have been translated into French first before English. So these are just kind of examples of, and it seems like German and French I kept coming across, it keeps being translated to there first and then into English, even though it seems like things go straight into English. So with that long introduction, I was wondering what your thoughts were about, do you get the sense that English is a bridge language still, or that it's becoming one among many bridge languages? So if we could start with Cristina.
I am afraid it is the bridge language, and we will see it more and more as the bridge languages. You only need to see which language are we speaking right now. It is a problem of prices. There you have translators, probably of every single pair of languages, from Romanian into Chinese. That would be perfect, but they will be more expensive. Pairs of languages are more expensive than any pair that includes English. English is being the most popular, is the one that is more accessible for publishing houses. Most publishing houses will have people reading in English, most of them. So, like it or not, it is a matter of how much we like it, because it is going to be that way, I'm afraid.
Cheryl?
I think it really depends what you're looking at. If you're thinking, for example, of translating from Polish into Chinese, then there's a good chance that you're going to go via English, because finding somebody who speaks Polish and Chinese is not terribly easy. But there are places in the world where translation between languages is reasonably common. I spend a lot of time in Finland, and Finland has a substantial Swedish-speaking minority there. And consequently, there's a whole bunch of people, including, of course, famously Tove Jansson, who write originally in Swedish. So there will be translation between Swedish and Finnish for both of the language groups there. Now, the book that I'm just about to publish is by the Croatian writer Alexander Zizek. And in Croatia, again, they were part of the former Yugoslavia. So there is cultural exchange between them and other parts of former Yugoslavia, and also various other parts of Europe. So Alexander's stories, some of them are available in English, but also some of them have been published in Serbia, they've been published in the Czech Republic, they've been published in Germany. So I think there's more of his fiction that is available in other languages than in English at the moment.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of Germany as a kind of interesting focal point that I keep coming across in these discussions. But Emily.
I think we, like Cheryl just brought up the issue of, let's say, translating Polish into Chinese. I think accessing translators is one of the big issues, but also just having to convince the publishing houses that this work is worth translating, even if it's not in English. I think that's one of the more realistic issues we face nowadays. I think especially because in the case of China, especially in speculative fiction, so much of our determining what's popular beyond China depends on what's popular in the English world. So that's kind of the only way for publishers to determine whether they want to buy this piece of work or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Raul?
Yes, I would agree with Emily on this point. So the problem is not so much the English as a language, which crosses bridges, which is fine, because it allows, if we accept it as a sort of universal language, it allows everybody to get to know other literature and other cultures. But the problem is what gets translated, no? What priority, especially in science fiction, where historically American science fiction is the predominant, best known, and in some places the only known. Up to, well, maybe now in the last few years things are changing a little bit, but not so much. So I don't have a problem with English being not the common currency, but I think we should make local markets across countries that are close by or that they're not. For instance, I take Italy and Spain, which is my closest. We know we work as a sort of a center periphery, US being the center, and we, despite our geographical closeness, we don't know each other's science fiction production, or very, very little gets translated, and this has been like this historically. So I guess that's the problem. It's good to have English if it allows also the local realities to get to know each other. I would like to know more of Spanish science fiction or Portuguese or whatever, German science fiction, Yugoslav science fiction, African science fiction, and so on. So,
thank you. Cristina, did you want to say something?
Yes, it is about what Cheryl and Raul are saying. It is obviously they are closer languages and closer people who are sharing something. But the problem is, how many copies of a book do you calculate you are going to sell? And it is very easy. You cannot afford a translation if you are going to sell 500 copies. You cannot afford a translation if you are going to sell 1,000 copies. It is, we translators we are poor and we are expensive at the same time. It is very sad.
Yeah, yes, Emily?
Right, so actually just adding on a different aspect, I think we've been talking about the industry more, but I guess another way to look at this is more on the technical aspect. So I want to bring up the example of the Japanese version of the three-body problem, which I think came out maybe last year or the year before. I don't really remember, but kind of in the past 1 year or 2 years. So from kind of digging into the translation story behind that, it's actually what we call like a relay translation. That is the first translator, which is Ken Liu, who translated the English version. He had already kind of taken the care to explain the cultural nuances and to kind of render the story in English first to an audience that's unfamiliar with Chinese culture. And the Japanese version actually takes into consideration both the English version and the Chinese version. So what came out in the Japanese version is actually a hybrid between these two languages, the mother language, which is Chinese, and the most popular / deemed most successful translation, which is English, which I think is not necessarily a bad thing, because when you have the first translator who's already kind of acted as the primary filter to not just to English audience in general, but in general, rendering the story to a group of people who do not necessarily know the Chinese culture and background behind it, having this explanation that's happening in English would actually help the translation work in different languages as well. So it saves the Japanese translator work if this translator could look at the English copy for inspiration.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love hearing stories like that, about how it's not just someone sits down with a text and says, okay, taken this from Polish into Japanese. Boom, done. Nothing's different. Nothing's interesting. Nothing happened. I just went from one word, this word to that word. It's a lot more interesting than just that kind of one-to-one idea. So yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess the next thing I wanted to talk about, which kind of goes on from this first question, is what is going on with translations among languages within a single country? So, for instance, in Spain, you have Spanish and Catalan and Basque and Galician. In India, you have so many languages. I don't even know how many. And in China, you have Mandarin and Cantonese. And of course, there are all the many different kinds of French and Spanish and just, spoken around the world. So, Cristina, would you like to tell us something about the translations within Spain, within the different Spanish languages?
Well, 2 days ago, I asked a friend of mine, Marc Pastor, a very amazing writer, Catalan writer. Hey, I really cannot wait for your novel to appear in Spanish. Don't hold your breath. It is not going to. Last one didn't either, because I had offers for the translation. They were the offers I were getting were ridiculous. They were not paying me money at all, and it is a problem. But that does not work the other way around. For example, from translating from Catalan into Spanish, the author that hardly gets anything unless he's super famous or something. But if they wanted to translate something from Spanish into Catalan, they would find a ton of help from the Generalitat, from the autonomic government. Same for Galician, same from Euskera. So that is not my ideal situation, because all people in Catalonia and in Basque Country are bilingual, while most people, I have been living 10 years in Catalonia, and I said, when I had been there for 3 years and I could read my newspapers and said, hey, this is easy peasy for me. I got a book and said, now I'm going to read real literature. It did not happen. It is not the same. So the problem is we cannot read them. We cannot read them unless there are some of the most famous, more important. Marc Pastor, we are not reading him. There is a difference right now in children's book. Children's books are being translated. I am thinking right now of Leticia Costas, a brilliant writer for children in Galician, and she's being translated. I really wish things were more fluid, but not. Well, again, we are going back to the money department. Mm-hmm. Do I look a bit obsessed with the money department?
For good reason, I mean.
I'd say so.
Cheryl?
Yeah, well, of course, in the UK, everybody speaks English, but that doesn't mean to say that it's the only language that we have. And increasingly now, because we have such a vile and English nationalist government in Westminster, the nationalist movements in various other parts of the country are gaining quite a bit of strength, which is interesting. Now, there is certainly, I mean, Southern Ireland obviously is a separate country, and there are people who write in Irish Gaelic. I'm not in a position to comment on that. So they do all come along to Octocon in October, folks, because that's going to be virtual. So you'll get to meet some wonderful Irish authors there. Scotland has, as far as I know, 2 languages. There's a Scottish Gaelic, which is similar to the Irish, but there's also Scots, which is an English dialect. And some of you may remember Ian Banks's novel, Fearsome Engine, which looks completely non-understandable when you first see it, but once you actually get the rhythm of it, you can learn to read it, and it's all English words, so just spelt completely differently and of course pronounced rather differently as well if you hear a Scottish people speaking it. In Wales, I did a little bit of research before this panel, and the first ever Welsh science fiction novel was published in 1957. It's a time travel story where the hero gets to visit two possible different versions of Wales. I'm going to completely mangle my Welsh pronunciation here, but it's called Wythnog in Cymru Fydd by Islyn Thog Ellis. And the idea is that the hero gets to visit two different versions of Wales in the year 2033, in one of which Wales is independent and a utopia, and in another of which Wales has been erased by English imperialists. It's a fascinating little book. It was actually published at the time by Plaid Cymru, who was the Welsh Nationalist political party. And I have been talking to somebody who's done an English translation of it. We still need to negotiate with the Ellis estate, but it's possible that Wizard Tower will be doing an English language version of that in the near future. Nowadays, of course, there are people writing new science fiction novels and fantasy novels and horror novels in Welsh. Not very many of them, but there are a few. And we do have a fine tradition of that. Of course, we're the only country in the world with a dragon on our flag. This is Ivor. The Mabinogion, of course, has been a source for lots and lots of fantasy. And our connection with Doctor Who is just ridiculous. Terry Nation, the inventor of the Daleks, is Welsh. Russell T Davies, who inspired the relaunch of Doctor Who, is Welsh. Torchwood HQ is in Cardiff, and so is the Shrine to Ianto Jones. So yeah, we're all over Doctor Who in Wales. And of course, The Prisoner was set in Porthmeirion as well. Yay.
Wales I want to visit one day.
Yeah, and we probably have more Hugos per head of population than any country in the world, thanks to Dave Langford having a ridiculous 29 of the darn things.
Emily?
Same here. I always want to visit Cardiff, so it's on my bucket list. So yes, I really do resonate with what Cheryl has been saying. So actually in Chinese as well, I think we have to make the distinction between orality and literacy. Because in the Chinese language, we do have many versions of dialects. But then the other thing is we share the same writing system. So you can't really tell on paper whether this person comes from like what part of China, because on paper, we all kind of communicate very similarly. So the question of kind of translating within China doesn't exist in that way. I think Cantonese, though, it's quite an interesting thing to talk about, because in Cantonese, there's a lot of words that are kind of meant more to be said and pronounced than to be written down. So the way to write them down, they're rendered in kind of very specific ways. People would just kind of sometimes put down like Roman letters or just in any way to present that this is what they're referring to, but there is really no character present to represent the concept behind that Cantonese language. I think there has been a variety of authors who came from the Canton area who have tried actively to write fiction using the Cantonese dialect, but eventually a lot of them just gave up on it because they found themselves stuck in a position where they can tell the story orally, no problem, but once it goes on paper, it's very hard to transfer what they can speak out, can pronounce into the Chinese like written system. So that's also one thing that's quite interesting to look into, because there's actually no good way of translating and preserving that sense of, I guess, like the dialect behind it. And what they had to do is to really kind of water it down and write it out in standard Chinese language script, which kind of defeats the purpose, because you can't tell whether this has intentionally been, if the writer had intentionally wanted to write this in Cantonese or not.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, Raul?
Yes, I don't know the situation in Italy about science fiction. Of course, there are many languages, many different languages and many dialects, and Napolitan Sardinian has many varieties, Sicilian, of course, Apulian, Friuli. But I don't know of anyone, because there's a history of homogenization of Italian that dates back to the fascist, to unification first in the late 19th century, and then with the fascist regime, to express yourself in your own language, whether it's Napolitan or Sicilian or Sardinian or Piemontese, will be stigmatized. I know of Tullio Avoledo, who writes about his country, which is Friuli, which was part of the Austrian, the Habsburgic kingdom. But I don't think he writes in its dialect. So I wish there could be. I'd love to read some Napolitan science fiction or Sicilian science fiction, but not at the moment. No. Of what I know, of my knowledge. Of course, there is literature, let's say current literature in these languages, but not science fiction, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've been translating a lot of Clelia Ferris, and she has a couple of her stories uses. Francesco was just saying in the chat. Clelia, she uses a lot of Sardinian slang. More in some stories than others, and I was finding, I had to go to the internet and I was looking like Italian to Sardinian, Sardinian to Italian. And then, yes, just coming up with, well, maybe I'm feeling like this means that. And then I would send it to her and ask her. And she said, yeah, that's right. Sounds good. And then other times she'd say, well, it's a little more nuanced. Having not been to Sardinia a little bit, really, I needed her to help me understand that. But having learned multiple languages, I'm not fluent in. Infer some things based on how some of the languages work, and that's been very interesting, because I didn't even know Sardinian was that different. Okay, so the next question, which I think goes to the money issue. We're going to talk about money. All money. So what kinds of institutional or private support, so grants, different awards, even crowdfunding sources, does speculative inflation get? Asia, more in the English-speaking world. Cristina?
Sorry, I missed the question completely. Sorry. I understood the first part of the question about money for grants or awards. Next one, please. As I said before, there might be official governmental helps for translating into one of the local languages, and that is very okay, because the amount of books you are going to sell in Galician is obviously inferior of the amount of books you are going to sell in Spanish. But that does not help with the big picture. And no, we don't get any kind. There is a Spanish award for translation, National Translation Award. It is given to one person once in a lifetime, not exactly enough to put a plate of food in your table every day. If you are, you would say that we can have, for example, the supermarket of English speaking, or sorry, of Spanish speaking, that is all Latin America, but that does not work that way. Transnationals are not working that way. They are not, but it is not many times they get your translated book and publish it in Peru or Argentina or Mexico or Venezuela or Chile. It is not very often. So it is, you are basically depending on how many copies of the book you will be selling in mainland, sorry, not in mainland, in Spain. And the good part is in Spain, literary translators, we have royalties. We get a small part of the, yes, that was a fight and it is wonderful.
Cheryl?
Okay, so the English government are completely awful, and the arts establishment in England is awful in its own way as well, in that the Arts Council looks down on fiction as filthy commercial stuff, not worthy of the name of art, and the literary establishment looks down on science fiction and fantasy as children's books. So there's really not a lot going on here. I'm pretty sure that the Welsh and Scottish governments will do quite a lot to try to support their own languages. But because I don't actually live in either of those countries or speak those languages, I've not seen anything to do with that. From my time in Finland, I must say that the Finnish government has been incredibly supportive of the Finnish attempts to spread their culture to the rest of the world. So they give literary prizes to people like Johannes Sinisalo, and so they have given a lot of support to FinCon and the other bigger conventions that the Finns have put on. So that's really good. And of course, within the European Union, there are grants available of various sorts. If Mihaela Pekovic was here, she'd probably tell us a bit more about that. But of course, that's no longer available to me because we're no longer part of the EU. Foot shoot.
Yeah, that's one of the not unexpected side effects that, you know, it's not like one of the first things you think about with the with Brexit, but yeah, you're not able to get those kinds of grants. Emily?
Hi. So I think from my perspective, I'll elaborate a little more on, I guess, just like science fiction and fantasy in China in general, instead of the big picture, because I guess like if I was to go on talk about just the entire translated industry, that'd be just a very long conversation. But actually, I think just last year, one thing very noteworthy, which stemmed from, I guess, this grassroots organization, we call it the Morning Star Award. It's originally meant to kind of like help younger writers get recognition by they can just enter the contest and have people who've already made their name in writing science fiction evaluate their work. It's only meant for the writers, but starting from last year, they established a new category that focuses particularly on translation, where they selected 3 pieces of just short science fiction, put it out there, and anyone who's interested in translating these Chinese stories into English and also French, they have 2 categories. They can come try and submit. And I was actually invited as like one of the first round judges to look at the translations. And we ended up actually getting a very good batch of emerging translators, which was a very pleasant surprise because from this, the people who kind of like make their way through, they are not only awarded with actual money, but also they can actually get comments from translators who've had more experience and also more opportunities to work in this field. So I think that to me is a very just pleasant surprise to see people actually putting effort into making a separate translation award happen. And also to mention that this award was established in honor of a translator named De Novo who actually unfortunately passed away in 2017. She's one of the earlier science fiction translators in China who I think translated William Gibson's Neuromancer into Chinese the first time. So the award was actually established in her memory. And so just everything about this award just makes me feel a lot of hope. And I just want to like give a shout out to the Morningstar Translation Award here.
Yeah, that's great. Raul?
No, no, there's no funds for specifically aimed at science fiction translation or science fiction literature. Science fiction in Italy is looked down on very much still, and there are translation fundings, awards, and we are actually trying to get one of those organized by the Italian Association of Publishers, but it's not specific. So we are trying to use it to publish science fiction, but it's not specific on science fiction. And it's difficult even to get those because you need a sort of prove a sort of cultural standing of the book you want to publish, and usually science fiction not considered culture. I hope that will change, but I don't know. At the moment, that's the way it is. Yeah. I guess in Spain, too.
I get the sense, I haven't really dove into it, but I get the sense that just in the US, it seems like there are a lot of opportunities for translation awards and funding in general. Nothing that I know of. I mean, there probably are some smaller pots of money, but I haven't looked into it because life, you know. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that could help. You know, money really does have a lot to do with what gets translated, what gets published, and so more of that funding would be helpful. So I guess if we could shift to, we kind of have talked about this a little bit already, but the unbalanced market of global science fiction. So, you know, sometimes it'll take years for a non-English bestseller to be translated into English, but it's just a matter of months for an English language bestseller to be translated into 20 languages. It's like instantly. I guess, is this partly a function of English being the language that's spoken around the world? Do you think that it's just that English publishers have tentacles everywhere that other people do not? You know, bridges or just kind of connections to other people. Just kind of what sense do you get of that, Cristina?
If you go to a book fair in Frankfurt or any of the big book fairs in Mexico, even they will speak the local language and English, and that is all. You cannot find somebody, a French publisher who speaks Romanian, or you cannot find an Italian publisher who speaks Chinese, so they can communicate. I understand this is not the ideal situation, but ideal is impossible. Ideal situation in which everybody speaks every language is impossible. We are not going to get that. So I am not feeling bad because English is our bridge. I am not resenting it. I am. If my agent can have the 20 first pages of my book translated into English, and so another publisher in Italy thinks, okay, this looks good, I might risk to pay for a reader to read it. That would be fantastic, but without that jump start that English gives us, I don't know what we would be doing right now. Sorry? Yeah. Do I sound very colonized?
No, honestly, yeah, it's the way it is. It's Anglo-cultural imperialism. I mean, the top-selling movies in India over the past couple of years have been the two Avengers movies. Everywhere you go around the world, people are inundated with Anglo culture. And because science fiction and fantasy has now taken over Hollywood, people are being inundated with Anglo science fiction and fantasy. So inevitably, that's what people look at when they're looking for things to translate. And of course, the other way, it's just a dead end. That certainly the publishers in the UK, I mean, they've occasionally tried to do translations, and every so often it's been successful. Mainly, the one thing that's been really successful has been Andrzej Sapkowski's Witcher series, and that's not because they are necessarily great books or that a lot of effort was put behind the marketing of it. It's because there was a hugely successful video game and everybody was buying the books based on that video game franchise. So that's what has made Sapkowski a global star. And now, of course, there's a Netflix series as well. So they've brought out new editions and everything. Now, really, the only way that science fiction and fantasy from other countries is going to be a hit in the English-speaking world is if something like that happens. So well done, the guys in Poland who made that video game.
I have to say that the Sapkowski's books were huge bestsellers in Spain before the video game. So maybe that is not the full reason.
Is there a lot of Polish, Spanish? Like, is there some sort of...
Not compared to England. In England, half of the population is Polish, isn't it? But no, in Spain.
I mean, there is a reasonably large Polish population in England as well. I think that would have helped push the books, but I don't think they would have been the success that they have been without the video game tie-in.
I don't know why the guy suddenly connected with the Spanish audience. I don't know if that is good or bad. But that happened. In Spain, the books were huge bestsellers long before the video game. Good. Okay.
Emily?
Hi. I think the other thing the other aspect of this question I want to bring up is, since now we've kind of all acknowledged that English is the gatekeeper language for just literature written in different languages to be translated, English is our kind of way, this portal that we can't avoid going towards. But I guess my question is, to what extent have we already kind of anglicized ourselves as translators or as writers, if we have the idea if we want to be translated in mind? Because I've definitely heard, I guess, this argument that, let's say in China, if I want my story to be internationally popular, I must write and think in a more kind of Anglophone infested way. I must write about things that I think the English speakers would care about purposefully, which gets into this kind of vicious cycle in a way that the more you're trying to be translated, the more you're trying to push yourself towards the pre-established Anglophone tradition, and the more this idea of, oh, everyone has to be first acknowledged by the English world before they can go anywhere else. This just becomes this just kind of spirals within itself. At least in my personal experience with especially the US readership, a lot of my US friends are not used to reading translated literature, especially not from East Asia. And their understanding of translated Chinese literature is also just very pre-modern or academic. So I guess think of the text first introduced to Anglo world by the sinologist, which I hate that word, not very contemporary. And all of a sudden, science fiction becomes this kind of cool thing, like what Cheryl said, in Hollywood, in games, in all over the place. And the young generation is just kind of like, oh, okay, this is something that we can also read and have fun. So then all of a sudden, this weird thing happens because a lot of the Anglo readers are just using the meager amount of translated Chinese contemporary fiction, or especially science fiction, which has gained a lot of attention over the past, not even decade, 5 years, and as a window into China. and consequently seeing China as a whole and Chinese culture as a static entity. So this is the current thing that's happening. And while I guess the English readers are putting their gaze on translated Chinese literature, Chinese writers and translators, on the other hand, are thinking of ways either to struggle away from that or kind of caving in and trying to get yourself to be a part of the game. So that's kind of the situation we're facing right now.
Raul?
Yes, well, I said already a few things before, but I think that with science fiction, there's a connection, I think, historical between the economic power and the technological advancement of a country in a specific time and its development of science fiction. So we historically in Italy, we grew up in the 50s and 60s, and not me, but those generation, with the economical boom was actually the science fiction boom as well during the 60s. But we had to import from the United States all the themes, the motifs, the repertoires, basically imitating them and then adapting them to our culture. And so we grew up with these, although we were producing early science fiction before, say at the, like Spain or like South America, they were producing proto-science fiction at the end of the 19th century, almost contemporary, at the same time as England or United States, but it wasn't acknowledged as a proper form of literature because there was a cultural and economic hegemony from the United States. And after the war, the US was a colony, it was colonizing culturally and economically in Italy. Their presence were really strong. So the science fiction authors imitated all the main authors, Asimov, Heinlein, and Sturgeon, and all of those main authors. So I think we're still leading the way. In Italy, now science fiction not so much popular as it can be in China. And China is living a huge economical growth and technological development in the past 10, 15 years. So I don't know what the situation is in China. I'd like to ask Jaime if they too are getting inspiration from the main works from American science fiction or English science fiction, or they are creating their own brand new science fiction. So that I would like to know that.
Right. So yes, just responding to your question, I do think the generation of science fiction writers who are born in maybe like 50s, 60s, like Liu Cixin, he wrote The Three-Body Problem. Definitely a lot of his influence came from what we kind of deemed as the English science fiction's golden age. So that generation definitely grew up reading all the writers you mentioned just now. So it also comes out through their work. And you see how they're very interested in talking about space and the focus on that. But moving into our kind of younger generation of writers who's born in more of 80s and 90s, their focus definitely took on a very different shift. I think a lot of my friends personally, they're trying to move away from what's been established in the English world as the science fiction tradition and trying to add more and more of their own personal expressions into creating whatever can be fitted under the science fiction genre category. So that's definitely one approach. But on the other hand, there's also people who are inspired by our older writers who were in turn inspired by the writers that you mentioned who wrote in English. So that's a other kind of different lineage. So right now, I would say in China, there's a lot of people trying a lot of different things in general. And not to mention that what you said, the bloom of kind of technology and science, and also the state's effort in just developing like science and technology and also putting that into education made more and more people turn to the idea of, oh, what if, how well could science fiction help us understand our current weird situation, our relationship with machines and people and the future? So it's been used in many different ways.
Yeah. Just want to come back on a couple of things of that. First of all, I would like to apologize to Raul for the colonization of his country after World War II. My father was part of that. He was in the RAF as part of the occupying forces, but he was in a radar unit, and these units tended to be drawn from the same part of the country. And there was a chap called Arthur C. Clarke in one of the other radar units. So, yeah, that might have had some influence on your science fiction, I don't know. But we've been talking largely about science fiction, and I think there's very much temptation because science fiction is seen to be a bit invented by the Americans, although of course they didn't really, but you have the Asimov and the Heinlein and whatever, that when you're writing science fiction, you have to write like that. And we shouldn't forget that there's this whole world of fantasy out there. And when people from other cultures are writing fantasy, it's much easier for them to play with their local traditions and their local mythology and so on, because there is no monolithic, the Americans did it this way that you had to copy. I'm thinking, for example, of Finnish fantasy. Maria Csikszentmihalyi, her last novel, Red Mantle, is a classic example of the Finnish relationship with the forest. If you look at an English language fantasy book, for example, Holstock's Mythago Wood, the forest is a scary place. It's where the monsters lurk. But for the Finns, the forest is a safe place. It's where they went to hide when the Swedes came and invaded them, or the Russians came and invaded them. So their fantasy forest is much different to ours. And interestingly, I'm just in the process of reading Fly Away by Catherine Jennings, which is a beautiful book, but it's also very, very Australian. And I'm absolutely loving that. There's a whole bunch of Australian words in there that I'm sure a lot of people are going to be scratching their heads over. And it's very much a novella, in fact, about life in country Australia.
Yeah, well, I think that's what you're saying makes me think about the fact that American science fiction seems universal, while any other science fiction seems local. Now, and you read it as local. Oh, this sounds Spanish science fiction, sounds Italian science fiction, because they mix. Whereas American science fiction made us think that they're science fiction. I don't know how they do it. It's universal. It doesn't have any American flavor, but it does.
I blame Star Trek.
Well, I mean, I've been seeing a trend just in science fiction, or speculative fiction in English translation from Korea, from Argentina, from I'm trying to think. I think there was one from Slovakia. Lots of surrealism that really walks the line between that's got some type of like science fiction element, but a lot of fantasy, but not even fantasy. It's just this kind of, and then of course there's weird, there's Finnish weird, there's Belgian weird, and that is very hard to categorize. But it seems like there's a lot more of cross-genre, cross kind of subgenre mixing going on that is being translated and published in English than ever before. And again, it's the who's publishing these, who is getting people to notice this kind of fiction, and why is this kind of fiction being translated? Again, it's kind of like a wave of like, if one thing is successful, then a whole bunch of other things are successful, or everybody tries to kind of mimic that. But I've been noticing that trend. It seems to be a lot of women writers also. They're these kinds of collections or short novels, like I know Samantha Schweblin has been very popular. Ha Song Nan has been getting very popular. Does anybody else want to talk about that kind of mixing of the different types of fantasy and science fiction?
Not me this time. Not me this time.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't thinking about mixing, but I was suddenly struck by the fact that there are different types of science fiction that are popular in other, different places. The most obvious example being solar punk, which, as I understand it, is absolutely huge in Brazil, and there are various other parts of the world where it is. But it's pretty much unknown in England, certainly in the UK, and I think it's relatively unknown in the USA as well. So I think it is possible for different countries to develop their own science fiction.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Raul.
No, I was saying absolutely.
My problem is not as much with the influence but with the writing, the actual writing. More and more I see young writers in Spain writing in like a bad translation from English. They write like really like a bad translation. It is you read in their dialogues. This is literal translation word by word. This is fucking amazing. In Spanish you cannot say that. You cannot say esto es jodidamente asombroso. No, por Dios. That is and that is the part that I am finding much more problematic than the influence about the themes or the genres or anything. It is the writing. The writing is of bad translations or just by reading English without being very good at Spanish to start with.
Yes. It was studied, I guess, in some manuals, translation manuals in Italy, it's called the translatese, no? Il traduttese, translatese.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you are so accustomed to read translations or from American or English novels that you just then, or television or cinema, I'm sorry about they're just trying to build a house right now. And that you end up speaking or thinking like that, you know, like the way you read or like the way you see a movie or a series or whatever. And
yeah, but that is the problem with the bad translations. We want to think that we are the bridge that brings those poor people who does not speak the language the gift from the novels published in another languages. Sometimes bad translation destroy completely, utterly authors. There was a publishing house in Spain that, well, I can give you a list of the authors that they destroyed forever, because the reader cannot, the reader will not be thinking, hey, this is a very bad translation. No, he will be thinking, what a shitty author. I cannot understand what he says. So I'm not going to mention names, but I can mention them later.
Okay.
Just adding on to what Cristina and Raul has been saying, like the exact same thing happens in the Chinese language. So I'm just very fascinated by hearing from your experiences, because that's one thing that has been kind of also just emotionally bothering me as I do my translations, because I translate from Chinese into English and the other way around. So having exposure to two different groups of audiences who will be reading my translations kind of gave me the observation of what exactly you have just mentioned. So in Chinese, we have kind of the equivalent of what we call a translator's voice, which comes from, let's say, like translating English into Chinese. It's somewhat a bad translation, like grammatically awkward, but not really. And then people somehow took in that and felt like, oh, this is posh, this is foreign, this is kind of westernized. And then eventually, instead of being like, oh, this is a bad translation, I think especially in the past when translated literature first started blooming in China, especially English translating to Chinese, people are just like, oh, this kind of translator style is cool. I will actively try to adopt it and use it in my own Chinese language works, because it would make me seem very like non-Chinese, to kind of add that edge of like, this is international. But on the other hand, when I translate from Chinese into English, a lot of times what ends up happening is that I try to kind of map Chinese concepts and ideas and styles onto English language. Even though the outcome is grammatically correct, it's totally fine. I would still get comments thrown at me being like angry comments. This is a bad author. This is a bad story. This reads like English, but it sounds like a translation. I'm just like, okay, what do you expect? It is a translation. But this example that I like talk about a lot really does give us an insight into the dynamics between translating from English into a different language versus translating into English. Like the readers are just so much more picky in English, the ones that I've experienced. And even just thinking about how the translator's style came into shape in Chinese is its own kind of branch of subculture relating to what Cristina was saying about style.
You're not the only country to have books ruined by bad translation, Cristina. The English have been guilty of that for many, many years. The classic example being their translations of Jules Verne. And Verne was a proud Frenchman, and he wanted to promote French culture and whatever in his books. And the English, of course, couldn't have that. The best example is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, in that book, Ned Land, the sailor, is firstly a communist and secondly hates the English. And both of those things had to be excised from the book in the original English translations, or it would never have sold here. Thankfully, we have new translations that are much more faithful to the original. But yeah, that sort of thing does happen.
Well, you know, translation was used during Franco times as a way of censorship. So it is, you can find delightful pieces of translations that were very creative. They are interesting parts of our job.
Yeah, even in when I'm watching a movie with English subtitles, but I know the language and they don't translate the exact thing. Like they say something and then the English translation is, they seem to take a lot of liberties. Mm-hmm. And I immediately say, why did they do that? And then, I pull back and say, okay, there's probably, there's thought given, I understand, but there can be, there's so much that goes into how things are translated based on who your audience is. If I could move on to one more question from our kind of general pool of questions, and then we're going to do a couple of questions from the general public. So the last one is kind of more of a focus on translation itself. So what would you advise specifically for your own experience with your language and the country you live in, if somebody were to come to you and say, I really want to translate from X language into Y language, what should I do? Should I enroll in translation studies? Should I contact the publisher? Should I make connections to editors? Should I just translate and send things out? What would you suggest if someone was interested in translating science fiction or fantasy? Cristina?
Get a real job. It's the first thing. It is not. There is very, very few people who can live from translating literature in Spain. We are paid, the usual rate is 1/3 of the non-literary translation. For example, if you translate the instructions manual for an elevator, you will be paid 3 times more than for a book. So my first recommendation will be learn a lot about elevators. You insist on having this very expensive hobby of being a translator? Well, learn a lot of Spanish, please. Read good Spanish. It's the first thing. You need to learn Spanish. Your English is secondary. or your other language is your first origin language is secondary. The important one is the target language. You really need to write a perfect, good target language. And then pray or something.
That's right. Cheryl?
All right, so I mean, my language is English, so there are a lot of people translating into it. The real question is how you're going to get published. And if you want to be published by one of the mainstream companies, then it's a question of, you know, having your agent go off to Frankfurt or London and desperately try to sell the book, which is not an easy thing to do. Now, as a small press owner, I would love to publish more translations, but I'm faced with the problem that I cannot afford to pay people to do it. You know, as Christina's been saying, translation is a big job. So for the most part, I haven't been able to do much. But what does happen, particularly around Europe, is that either the author will try to translate themselves, or they will have a friend who will say, well, I will translate it for you. Now, to a certain extent, of course, that's taking advantage of people, but you know, taking advantage of people happens all the time in small presses. It's just the way of the world. I certainly don't make any money out of running Wizard's Tower, but I do try to pay other people. And the approach that we took with the Alexander Zizek book is that he had already translated all of his stories into English, and he wanted me to publish them. And I had a look and I thought, this is perfectly understandable English, but it's not natural English. It's not 100% what a native English speaker would do. So I brought in an editor who worked with Alexander and took the really quite good English that he had and turned it into English, which we hope is, you know, sounds like it's just written by a native English speaker. And that, of course, is not as expensive as doing the entire translation yourself. Now, I don't know if that's a viable business model. I don't know if I'm being fair to the people who do that. And quite frankly, we're a small press. I only expect to sell a few hundred copies of the book anyway. Alexander is, would like to see his work out there to a larger public, and if I sell more, then great, wonderful. But we'll see. The previous Croatian book, I've got Contact, for which I had to take their existing translations. That's only sold between, I think, 50 and 60 copies. But the Croatians are really pleased that I sold it because it's 50 or 60 people that they would never have reached otherwise. So it's
great. I loved it. I often think back on a lot of those stories, and I wish that more people. It was just in more people's faces, but.
Yeah, well, I wish I'd been able to put that through an English editor, because they were great stories. They were really wonderful stories, but one or two of them could do with a bit of polishing. And hopefully next year we will have another Croatian book. I've been working with Mahela Perkovic on an anthology of feminist science fiction, which unfortunately has been derailed by a combination of COVID and the unfortunate death of one of the participants. But we're fingers crossed that will happen. And Mahela, Alexandra and I are doing a panel at Eurocon in the beginning of October, which will be virtual, so you'll be able to pop in and see what we have to say about it.
I'll be there. Emily?
So I think to just agree with what Christina's been saying, translators in China are also just very, very underpaid. So please make sure you have a place to live, you have food, you have a job. That's like definitely the first thing. It's really hard to launch translation into a full-fledged career. Honestly, I do agree. And also we're not just competing with kind of each other, but also the small group of people who are really producing bad translations by putting things through like Google Translate and kind of like changing stuff around and calling it, oh, okay, this is my completed book. And they can do that in like, let's say a month versus us. Like it would take maybe 3 to 5 times that speed. So right now, I think the market just has those people. It also has people who are trying to really do things. It's just all very a complicated situation. But turning to science fiction, in China specifically, we're actually in a pretty dire need of more translators. I think especially, inevitably, you have to talk about the three-body problem. I think following the success of that, all of a sudden, everyone in China is like, wow, let's all get translated. So a lot of attention has been put on translating science fiction in China, especially from Chinese into English, and now increasingly so other languages, thanks to efforts of people who are not from Anglophone countries coming to China and interacting with us and letting people here know that there are many other possibilities. So we actually are seeking a lot of like new blood, and which is a pretty good time right now, I would say, to try out translation, especially science fiction in China. So I think I'm actually gonna like put in a positive note here. I guess like to think about a tip that I would give to an emerging translator is that I think a lot of times you would find yourself in very frustrating and stressful situations where you're kind of torn between, on one hand, people do expect you to be somewhat invisible. People do expect you to completely kind of cut out your voice, your presence, and just produce the text as it is. There's still, I guess, a idea somewhere out there that translators are just not as valued or should be somewhat neglected. And I think the more you get into this industry, the more you have to deal with that. And also dealing with, when you have the editor, you have the writer, there's a lot of negotiating to do. So oftentimes you're very like stuck in the middle, trying to pass words from one person to another, and also trying to balance all that. So one example would be, especially when me and my writers communicate with, let's say, an American press, the editor would sometimes just kind of give me the request of, oh, could you make this person's work just completely the same as what we would read in America, which is just difficult because on one hand, you want to preserve the writer's originality. You want to show that it is indeed a translated work and not just something that any kind of English-speaking writer could produce. But on the other hand, the editor and the target audience has their own taste that you need to cater to. So really being stuck in that position and being asked to perform this colossal feat of what should I do? Like, you're just often caught into a lot of ideologies, and I think thinking too much into that can get you very frustrated. So I guess being mentally prepared, knowing your own style, knowing how you want to do your work is really the first step to making everything happen. And then you can negotiate from there.
These are great. These are really great suggestions. Raul?
Thank you. I don't have many suggestions. I haven't found the right model that works for me. There's many things. Sometimes you really want to translate something. You translate it, or you translate one part and make a proposal that works for the Italian market, for example. And if the publisher is interested, he will make you an offer, and you hope that with that offer you can eat for a week or two. Sometimes it's the publisher that calls you and tells you, would you like to translate it? But as Cristina was saying, the fees are really, really low at the moment. So I don't know.
At the moment.
Economic. Did
I miss a moment when they were wonderful?
It's a huge moment.
Yes.
Well, there was
but it depends on the market.
Yeah.
Also, because when we translated, translated Caroline Merchant, The Death of Nature, which is it's an essay from the 80s. The first, I think, ecofeminist essay by Caroline Merchant, and we got a pretty good deal, but working from the United States. But if I have to work within the Italian or Spanish market, I need another job or two to get by. So that's why I have a bookshop in the translation and many other things.
Well, I've just found that just from research that I was doing, that in the 60s and 70s, there was an unbelievable amount of Russian science fiction that was translated and published in the US. And then I found that Theodore Sturgeon was commissioned by Macmillan to write introductions for a lot of these. And you had a lot of, you had the same kind of translators translating the lots of anthologies and novels and collections. You know, this is at the height of the Cold War. And there's, so the technology, you know, with the space race between the US and Russia, and then people learning lots of Russian, and then all of this flowering of science fiction, it kind of came together into this unbelievable amount of Russian science fiction in English. That is definitely, you know, a lot of it is dated now, but, you know, some of it really, I mean, like the Strugatsky's, it just lasts forever. So, yeah, there has to be a confluence in I think in a culture of multiple factors that really encourage a lot of publishing of translations. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I would like to ask everybody, I'm going to just throw it out there, anyone can answer. A question that people would like to know who are watching. So what would you advise us to read if you could pick one book, story? It can be in any language, considering that this is an international. I know this is really hard, but anything that you have recently translated or that you recently read or you've written that is being translated, anything like that, something you would recommend to listeners. Actually, all of you should answer this. So, but
yeah, okay. So I'm going to start because Tor have just started this new series of masterworks, and one of the books that they published in it is The Hair Carpet Makers by Andres Eschbach, who is an absolutely brilliant German science fiction writer. And I read it years back when it was initially translated into English. I loved it, and John Clute loves it as well. So yeah, do pick that one up because it's a great book.
Yeah, he's great. Other recommendations?
I would suggest Clelia Farris, which you translated, because I think it was my discovery from, like, when I read the first book, actually, how I met her was at the time I was doing this magazine, science fiction and fantasy magazine, and I asked Francesco to give me some short stories, and he sent me one of Clelia Farris, and I loved the short story. And then I started reading. I asked her to send me her novels, and actually love the way she writes. So there's this anthology that Rachel translated, so I absolutely advise everybody to read it.
Yeah.
Yes, that's my suggestion.
Which of her novels do you think should be next on my translation bucket list?
I love Nessun Uomo è Mio Fratello. Mm-hmm. That yeah. I think because it's a sort of dystopian, but with clearly her hand is there to create this estrangement by creating these characters and this environment where you don't really know where you are. You know, there's some China there, Chinese names with Sardinian landscapes, and sort of everything is mixed up, and you don't really know where you are. And then there's, I love the story of these. I won't tell anything, not to spoil, but I love that. No man is my brother. That would be the title in English. I
will
hope
go
it
for...
gets translated soon.
Hey, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
No, I will go for a book I know that has been both the rights for translation for 20-something language. So I suppose English will be one of them, and you all will be able to read it. It's Jose Carlos Somoza. Is a brilliant, probably one of the best writers we have right now in Spain. And his last novel is, I will not say it is a Sherlockian pastiche because it is not, but it is. It is a crazy, surreal, new, it is putting upside down everything you think you know about Sherlock Holmes. It is mixed with a lot of, not fantasy, because it is not fantasy, it is surreal, it is different. It is so different and so amazing that I cannot even put it into a genre. It is something you have to discover. This is the same guy who won was finalist of the Dagger Award and published The Art of Murder, also a science fiction, absolutely amazing novel. I cannot imagine why he's not known in all the world, but I am a big fan. This book specifically, the title in Spanish is Estudio en Negro, so I suppose the translation will be something in the sense of a study in black.
Mm-hmm. Emily, do you have anything?
Sorry, I'm just like taking down notes rapidly because I want to like read all your volumes, and I'm really bad at spelling, so I'm just like typing. So as we have kind of touched on the topic of just linguistic colonization, I want to recommend a short story called The Language Sheath by Regina Wang Kanyu. So she's a Chinese science fiction writer, and that work is actually co-translated by herself and me. So she did the initial kind of draft and I did the editing, which is also cool because you get to see how the writer herself is actively involved in this process. It's published by Clarkesworld magazine. It's available online, I think published in May, maybe last year, or yeah, sorry, this year. But that's definitely really worth looking at because the story itself, it just talks about how in a world where one language has been so prevalent that other kind of more radical people are trying in many ways to preserve what's in the original language and the problems that kind of stem from that. So it's a story that's really like meta in the way that it talks about the core of language, of translation. So it's really worth checking out. And I think another, like, this is like me doing kind of like a shameless self-promotion, not really, but right now we're actually collaborating with Tor and working on a anthology that features an all-women cast from Chinese science fiction and fantasy. And I know that science fiction from China has been very like prominent, but fantasy not as much. But this anthology features a lot of previously untranslated fantasy stories as well. And it's coming out, well, in the future, sometime next year or the year after. We're still working through the process. And I think it's definitely super worth checking out because it really shows a different side of just translated Chinese SFS in general. And right, it's like spoiler, I guess, for this crew specifically. We're not onto the promotion stage yet, but I just kind of want to mention it because it's cool.
That sounds great. I'm really looking forward to that. So that we only have a few more minutes. I wanted everyone to have time to go around and say where we can find you online, anything you want to promote, like if you have a website, if you have you know, social media that you want people to follow, just tell us where we can follow you, and when we have questions for you, where we can send them, because you know I have a billion questions that I want to send all of you. So after this. So Cristina, could you go first?
I am in Facebook all the time, far too long in Facebook.
Facebook, okay. Facebook, yeah, I know Facebook's pretty, you know, social media can be really toxic, but I found that if you curate it according to the very narrow parameters of science fiction translation and editors, it works out well. Cheryl?
I'm mainly on Twitter as @CherylMorgan, but if you Google Cheryl Morgan, I will be all over the front page of Google on that because I've been online since 1997. So I've had a time to build up a presence. And when this is over, I'm going to dive into the Discord and I will be available to remind people about the books that I'm talking about and post links and all that sort of stuff.
Great. And I recommend reading your blog as well, because you have a lot of great news and information that I go there to find out what's happening.
Thank you.
Emily?
I also use Twitter. So I'm not always on Twitter, but you can always like find me, just like leave a message, pretty easy to find. So I think, yeah.
Raul?
Facebook. I don't have Twitter. I don't have a personal Instagram, just Facebook. So yeah, that's where you find me. Raul, CHI.
I suppose this means we will not be seeing each other anymore.
And you can find me on Facebook. I have a speculative fiction and translation Facebook page, and Twitter at rcordas, so RCORDAS. So I do a lot on Twitter for basically just saying what's coming out next, and the website sfintranslation.com. And there you can find how to contact me, Rachel at sfintranslation.com. Also, I invite people to comment, people to send in anything about SFT. I really don't know what's like. I think some people think that I have some sort of mental connection to like some sort of SFT world. And I really don't have enough time to read all the amazing things that are coming out or to search for them. So if you guys need to send me things that you're finding, and I will post them on the website, because this is a joint effort. And I really just put together the lists and keep them updated, so it's easy to find. Any last things that you guys wanted to say? I just wanted to say first, thank you guys for being on this panel. And thanks to everyone at FutureCon for putting this together. Any last thoughts before I?
Definitely want to say thank you to FutureCon. I think this is an amazing project that you've got here. So well done, everybody.
Yes.
Same here. I think the cause of FutureCon is something that I personally really agree with, and the efforts of just moving away from excellent tradition, and even just me having the chance to speak to translators who are not just all about, let's say, like America. To me, it's like just really refreshing, and I've learned so much from all of you during this panel. So I had a great time. Thank you, FutureCon. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you for having us here. Gracias desde España.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Just
Everyone watching, subscribe to the FutureCon YouTube channel, and definitely join the conversation on Discord, which is a great place to talk about a million different things related to SFF around the world. And also, if you want to support FutureCon, you can find links for that on the website and the YouTube channel. And I hope that this happens every single year because I've had a great time. And well, hopefully the conversations will continue. So thank you to everyone for being on the panel, and we will see you later. Ciao.
Ciao.
see you on Discord.